Eve Nance fell in love with Tim at 16, and they'd been married for more than 15 years.
Tim would say, "I love that woman." And Eve would tell me the same. "I love that man."
And with a daughter to raise, Eve and Tim built a simple life together.
Eve worked so hard. She was a caregiver to her family.
My dad tried, and they kind of just made the best of it.
But in November of 2013, Tim went missing from their Wisconsin home.
No one could get a hold of Tim. Tim wasn't checking in with anyone. That's what started to raise red flags.
Your whole routine does not change in an instant unless there's foul play involved.
The search for the missing man would reveal that Tim had a secret life.
Sometimes he would go for a couple of days or a week.
He said, "Oh, I'm just having my cake and eat it too."
And his marriage to Eve wasn't what it seemed.
The police were called to their house for domestic issues numerous times.
My dad was the aggressor.
Timothy had been threatened by Eve.
And his disappearance left family, friends, and investigators wondering, had one of them finally gone too far?
He had the gun. He was waving it around. I was just begging for him to just go. Just go.
Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, November 5th, 2013. It was a quiet Tuesday in this town of 40,000, an hour north of Milwaukee.
Fond du Lac is your all-American, all-Wisconsin city.
It's beautiful, and it's a good place to raise your family. Fond du Lac is very boring. It's very slow.
Nothing really much happens, not really much to do.
But that Tuesday, the small town's police department would suddenly have a mystery on their hands. A 37-year-old Fond du Lac resident named Eve Nance called in and reported her husband, Tim, missing.
No one could get a hold of Tim. Tim wasn't checking in with anyone, not only Eve, but his friends either.
And 37-year-old Tim Nance had a lot of friends in Fond du Lac.
Everybody knew who he was. He had a big smile. He talked a lot and had a million stories to tell.
Eve told the police she'd last seen Tim on Friday night.
Not seeing Tim for a couple of days wasn't the most abnormal thing.
When he wanted to do his own thing, he would go do his own thing.
However, according to Eve, Tim typically kept in touch while he was away. But not this time.
It was very unusual for nobody to hear from Tim all weekend long.
Even more unusual, Eve said he wasn't answering his phone either.
She seemed very worried, a little aggravated that he wasn't returning her calls.
And when he didn't come home on Monday or Tuesday, Eve said she'd really begun to worry.
That's what started to raise red flags, that maybe he wasn't just out having a good time.
So Eve had decided to call the police.
She seemed genuinely upset and confused as to where he was.
But in the days ahead, the authorities would be wondering, was her confusion genuine? Or did Eve know exactly where her husband was? Born in 1976, Eve Stidham started life far from the quiet shores of Fond du Lac.
Eve was born in Chicago. We grew up on the north side of Chicago. She was definitely an extrovert. She was an outgoing kid, and pretty much kept that throughout her whole life.
My aunt's really funny. She'd always be like the one making jokes about everyone.
And when the 16-year-old met Tim Nance in 1992, her sense of humor was an easy fit with Tim's ready grin and rapid-fire wisecracks.
He was the jokester, told the jokes, made everybody feel comfortable.
He was very street smart. He was a very social guy.
He was just so charismatic, he just drew people in.
Which is exactly what happened when he met Eve at a friend's party.
The first time she looked at Tim, she was in love with him.
And Tim felt the same way about Eve.
Tim would say to anybody, unashamed, "I love that woman." And Eve would tell me the same. "I love that man."
They both had a real fun-loving, easygoing personality. They both liked to have a good time and joke and laugh.
Soon, the two teenagers had moved out of their parents' houses and into their own apartment.
They were both pretty mature at a young age, and she moved in with Tim within a couple of months of them getting together.
Though they struggled to support themselves on their own, the teenagers were soon starting a family.
It was more of a shock than a surprise. They were 16 years old, and they had to explain this to both of their families and everything else.
With a baby on the way, Eve and Tim decided they would need to get married.
He was very happy. He knew she was someone he wanted to marry. He loved her very much.
At 17 or 18 years old, they weren't doing the normal stuff 17 or 18-year-old kids were doing. They were paying bills and buying diapers. This was going to be their life. They were going to have a baby. They were going to be parents, and there's no change in that.
But even as the couple planned their wedding, another unexpected change would derail their future. In August of 1994, Tim was at home one afternoon when he heard Eve, 9 months pregnant with their daughter Tamika, screaming on the sidewalk outside their apartment.
Someone was assaulting Eve. Tim came out there with a pistol, and while threatening the guy and getting him away from Eve, Tim shot him in the foot.
The wound wasn't fatal, but despite the fact that he'd been trying to protect Eve and their unborn child, the police placed Tim under arrest, and the trauma of seeing him hauled off in handcuffs was enough to send Eve into labor.
He went to jail the day that Tamika was born.
Tim spent nearly a year in jail on assault charges. But Eve stayed in touch with her fiancé and brought their daughter along on every visit to the jail.
We would make really long trips to go see him and stuff, and like she would still have him in my life regardless.
Being that he was locked up didn't change the fact that that was Tamika's father.
And as soon as he was released in 1995, Eve and Tim didn't waste any time planning their long-awaited wedding.
The day he got released from jail, on the way home from picking him up, they stopped at the courthouse and got married.
Tim and Eve settled into married life, and a few years later, the family moved to Fond du Lac.
We moved up here pretty much to better ourselves and better our life.
In fact, Fond du Lac appeared to be such a positive change for the young family that Eve's little sister and her children soon followed her to Wisconsin.
My aunt was pretty much like my second mom, so she would always be there for me. Me and my cousin, we were pretty much raised as like sisters.
However, as much as Eve loved her new home, life in Wisconsin wasn't perfect. Tim's felony conviction made it hard for him to find work.
Tim worked more on and off throughout their entire relationship, probably more off than on.
And because of that, he mostly stayed home as Mr. Mom.
He would say, "Baby, you been at work all day, come home, relax. I got dinner done, everything."
He liked cooking, like he wanted to go to school for culinary arts when he was younger.
In addition to the couple's daughter, Tim also looked after her cousin.
He babysat me every day because my mom would be at work. We were like really close.
Meanwhile, it fell to Eve to support the family. Once in Wisconsin, she took a job at a local assisted living facility.
Eve and I were caregivers for people with mental disabilities. Eve worked so hard because she was a caregiver to her family. She wanted to give them kind of above and beyond.
And she always pushed her daughter to do better.
She would always tell me, go to school, keep furthering yourself. Instead of like going out to party and stuff, she'd be like, shouldn't you be studying?
Tim, on the other hand, took a more laid-back approach.
As long as I was safe and I let them know where I was going and stuff, my dad really didn't mind.
Maybe Tim didn't mind his daughter having a little fun, because once Eve was home from work and dinner was done, he'd often slip out to enjoy what nightlife Fond du Lac had to offer.
My dad would go out. He would go play pool and be a social person, see what was out there, talk to people.
But in the fall of 2013, Eve said Tim had gone out for the evening as usual. Only this time, he didn't come home. Coming up, in an effort to find Tim, Eve reveals her husband's secret life.
When it first started, it was more hidden.
But some wonder if Eve might be better off without him.
Regardless of the ups and downs, she stuck through it.
On Tuesday, November 5th, 2013, 37-year-old Eve Nance called the police in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and said that her husband, Tim Nance, had been missing since Friday.
At first, I thought that he was off doing his own thing and just didn't want to be bothered right now, which wasn't uncommon.
Because after devoting all week to taking care of the kids, the weekend was Tim's time.
He liked to go out. He liked to hang with his friends.
But according to Eve, she hadn't been able to get in touch with him all weekend.
It wasn't really like my dad to not always answer his phone.
And he hadn't come home on Monday or Tuesday either.
That was what was starting to spark interest, that something might not be right here.
But where could Tim have gone? Eve told the police she had an idea. She said that while they'd moved to Fond du Lac years ago in order to provide a safer environment for their daughter, Tim had always missed the big city excitement they'd left behind.
It's a small town, a lot different than Chicago, that's for sure.
But with Chicago a full 3 hours away, Eve told the police that Tim typically had to satisfy his big city cravings in Milwaukee instead, a mere hour away.
That's a little bit more who he was, so that's kind of where he liked to spend his time.
But according to Eve, Tim's trips to Milwaukee were for more than just hanging out and playing pool. She said he was on the hunt for drugs. Eve told the missing persons investigator it all started as a result of Tim's old assault conviction, a felony on his record that made it hard for him to find steady work.
Her husband didn't put a lot on the table and was unemployed a lot. They were kind of struggling up in Fond du Lac.
And with Tim often out of work, Eve had been forced to make up the difference.
She was the family breadwinner. She was the one who really was supporting her child.
My mom worked a lot and my dad tried, and they kind of just made the best of it.
So Tim tried to help out, finding ways to earn a little extra money.
He had to make a hustle any way he could. So he went out and did his little hustler for his family.
Although according to Eve, Tim's hustling essentially amounted to one thing.
She said he was this drug addict and this drug dealer.
But over time, according to Eve, he'd begun to sample more than he sold.
We did know that he was kind of into drugs.
And according to Eve, that meant that she'd ended up supporting the family and her husband's drug habit.
She was hardworking, always provided for everyone, and my dad kind of used that to his advantage.
If you've got someone else that's taking care of that aspect a little bit, well, then you're a little more free to do the funner things in life.
And according to Eve, Tim's fun extended to more than just drugs.
He had other women or saw other women on the side.
He wasn't 100% about me and my mom. He kind of led a double life.
Eve wasn't sure exactly when her husband had begun cheating on her.
When it first started, it was more hidden, a little more, the stereotypical cheating where you're sneaking around and things like that.
But Eve said that as the years passed, Tim's cheating had become more blatant.
Sometimes he would go for a couple of days or a week and stay with a girlfriend and then come back home again.
Eve said that as Tim's cheating became obvious, friends and family had begged her to leave him.
I did ask her, how could you stay in a relationship like this? She told me that she would rather have some of Tim's time than none of it at all.
After all, Eve had been in love with him since she was 16.
My mom was very committed in the relationship. She never really thought about leaving him. Regardless of the ups and downs, she stuck through it.
Although she didn't always accept it. Talking to the police, Eve admitted that she and Tim had often fought over the years.
He wasn't always there like he should be, as supportive as he could have been, and that's when fights and stuff would happen.
In fact, according to Eve, she and Tim had been fighting the last time she saw him.
They had gotten in an argument Friday night, and he left, and she thinks he went to Milwaukee.
That, in and of itself, wasn't too unusual, according to Eve.
People can go cool off, leave for a couple days.
And at first, Eve said she hadn't been too worried, and those who knew Tim felt the same way.
At first, I didn't think anything of it at all. I thought that he was off doing his own thing.
It wasn't too alarming to me, really. I figured he would show up.
But after he failed to come home on Tuesday, Eve had decided to call the police.
She stated that he had a drug problem and he may have relapsed, so she was reporting him missing at that time.
As a theory, it sounded plausible to the police.
Tim had a history of multiple drug offenses.
Tim's record may have made Eve's claim that he'd gone off on a so-called drug binge seem credible. But when the investigators talked to Tim's friends, they told police a very different story about Tim's involvement with drugs.
He, at one point, dealt a little weed. He wasn't a hardcore heroin dealer. He went to Milwaukee on a drug binge, is what she said. But he didn't do drugs like that, so that wasn't true.
And while Tim's friends admitted he was unfaithful, they told the investigators that was because Eve had pushed him away.
She was very controlling. Everything's got to be her way.
She always degraded him. And she used to say little things like to make herself feel like she was a better person.
And in his friend's version, it was Tim, not Eve, who'd suffered in silence.
Several witnesses report that Timothy was not happy in his relationship with Eve.
Was Tim simply taking a break from his troubled marriage? Was it possible he had gone to Milwaukee, as Eve suggested? Hoping for some confirmation, the investigators contacted Tim's cell phone provider.
A cell phone signal will ping off of 3 different towers, and it'll give you an idea of the location as to where the cell phone was last used or where it's being used currently.
But when the investigators pulled his cell phone records, they made a troubling discovery.
There was no cell phone activity.
What could explain Tim's silence? Was it possible he'd been in an accident? Or perhaps had an overdose, as his wife suggested?
They start to check hospitals in case, something happened.
But there was no sign of Tim. As the days continued to pass with no word from the missing man, his friends and family really started to worry.
Everyone kind of went from thinking, well, this is something that's happened before, to, okay, now maybe we should start being concerned that something's wrong.
So even as the police launched an official investigation, Tim's family and friends had begun their own search.
We started making posters, like me and my sisters went and copied posters and took them around, asking people if they've seen him and stuff.
And despite a sometimes troubled relationship, it appeared that no one wanted to find Tim more than Eve.
She was right there alongside of them, doing candlelight vigils and making posters and putting up flyers and searching.
Tim was, I believe, the only man she ever loved in her entire life.
But would Eve and Tim ever be reunited? On November 13th, with the official search for Tim in its second week, the authorities made an appeal to the public for help.
They put out a new press release asking for help from hunters.
It might have seemed like a logical request.
If you've ever been to Wisconsin and during hunting season, there are thousands and thousands of people who go into the woods, and a hunter could help them find the person who was missing.
However, while the police didn't come right out and say it, the press suspected that asking hunters to scour the winter woods for a man who'd been missing almost 2 weeks signaled an unspoken shift in the investigation.
This was a game changer. You're not just looking for an individual, but pretty sure that the individual you're looking for is no longer alive.
Coming up, could Eve be responsible for Tim's disappearance?
Witnesses had reported a couple incidences in which Timothy had been threatened by Eve.
And if so, can the investigators prove it?
Am I being charged with something here?
By November 13th, 2013, it had been 8 days since 37-year-old Eve Nance had reported her husband, Tim, missing. And it had been almost 2 weeks since she said he'd walked out of their Fond du Lac, Wisconsin home after an argument and simply disappeared.
The fact that no one could get a hold of him was what was starting to spark interest that something might not be right here.
He would take his phone wherever he go. He would respond to people's texts, to their phone calls.
And that led the police to an inescapable conclusion.
Your whole routine does not change in an instant unless there's possibly foul play involved.
However, the fact that Tim wasn't answering his phone wasn't the only thing that led the police to that conclusion.
Witnesses had reported incidences in which Timothy had been threatened by Eve.
One of those witnesses was an old friend of Tim's named Deborah Hilt. She told the investigators that she'd first met Tim 6 years earlier, in 2007.
We just clicked right away. Personality-wise, we clicked. We had a lot to joke about, talk about.
In fact, Deborah said they had clicked so well that Tim all but moved in with her.
He spent all of his time with me.
Because according to what Tim had told Deborah, his marriage was essentially over.
My impression was that he was living separately from her. Tim's description of their relationship was one of convenience.
Tim may have told Deborah it was a marriage of convenience, but what she didn't know at the time was that Eve had actually been desperate to save her marriage.
This was Eve's one and only love. They got married young, and they met when they were 16 years old.
She didn't want nobody to miss what she had. She didn't want another woman to take that from her.
And according to what Tim's friends told the investigators, Eve had tried to win Tim back, showering him with expensive gifts and even a new car.
The car was his baby, his everything.
But when even the car failed to win Tim back, friends said that Eve had gone from desperate to dangerous. According to Tim's friend Benjamin Bobo, he'd received a troubling call from Eve in the winter of 2009.
She said, Ben, you need to come get your friend out of this house, or I'm going to do something that I'm going to regret.
Eve had driven over to Deborah's, apparently at her wit's end.
Eve Nance demanded that Tim Nance come out of the apartment.
Tim's friend, realizing that Eve was unstable and that his friend was possibly in danger, had rushed right over to Deborah's apartment. But he was too late to stop an angry confrontation.
We hear Eve screaming, Tim! Tim! And she's walking in through my front door.
When I got there, she was inside of the house.
Deborah says that when he heard Eve screaming his name, Tim had rushed out of the bedroom to confront his wife.
She's at the bottom of the stairs and she's got a gun.
A gun she was prepared to use, according to Deborah.
She had declared to him, I'll kill you. I will kill you.
Luckily, Tim's friend intervened just in time.
Ben was behind Eve, pulling her by her hand, telling her, let's go, you don't want to do this.
I got out of the house. Tim came down, he talked to her. I went back and talked to Tim's girlfriend, like, it's going to be okay. They just needed to talk.
Tim had managed to calm his wife down, and the potentially deadly confrontation came to an end. But after 2 years of dealing with his failing marriage, seeing Eve storm into her apartment with a gun was enough to convince Deborah to dump Tim before someone got hurt.
I knew that Eve was unstable. I didn't want to deal with Eve anymore. I knew what that life would be like. I knew what it would be like, and I didn't want a part of it.
Deborah may have been out of the picture, but that didn't mean Tim went back to Eve, at least not entirely.
He still did have, I know, at least 2 girlfriends in those next couple of years.
Girlfriends he didn't even try to hide from Eve.
He literally at times would come home with another woman.
In fact, one friend told the police he'd witnessed another potentially deadly showdown in August of 2013, less than 3 months before Tim disappeared.
He was an eyewitness to an incident in which Eve had caught Timothy in bed with a girlfriend in their residence. And he observed Timothy and Eve struggling over a handgun.
Tim's friends told the investigators they'd urged Tim to leave his wife for good. But Tim, who depended on Eve's financial support, had always refused.
I said, what are you doing, Tim? He said, oh, I'm just having my cake and eat it too. And I said, well, I'm not for that, but don't let her kill you.
Had Tim's cavalier attitude about infidelity cost him his life? His friends were convinced.
I know from dealing with Eve that she snapped on him.
I knew right away she killed him.
And based on what Tim's friends told them, the investigators were inclined to agree.
They were pretty open about saying we believe there was foul play involved.
But could they prove it? On November 20th, the investigators descended on Eve's house with a search warrant. And in the bathroom, they made a suspicious discovery.
They had the physical indications within the shower stall, the markings on the wall indicating that a bullet had struck the wall. The police firmly believed that they had solved the crime.
And they decided to turn up the heat on Eve.
They came to her house and asked her to come to the station.
At the station, Eve maintained that she had no idea what happened to Tim.
I thought he was on a drug binge. Now I have absolutely no idea.
Confronted about Tim's infidelity, Eve tried to downplay it, but didn't deny it.
He was a good husband other than the cheating.
Were you kind of mad at Dad?
Oh, like I said, I knew the relationship.
However, she did deny ever threatening Tim with a gun after catching him with another woman.
That night never happened that they're talking about me catching him in bed.
But her denial of that incident made little impact on the investigators.
I want to work with you, Eve.
And I told you what happened.
You killed him?
No, I did not.
And that's when the investigators confronted her about the bullet hole in her bathroom.
We found the bullet.
Well, then you need to arrest me if you found a bullet.
I need to tell you. I need you to tell me what happened. And I'll tell you where we found it. And you know where we're going to find it because you didn't find it. We did.
All of a sudden, now the panic sets in.
Am I being charged with something here?
What do you think?
I'm asking you. I don't know.
She told them that she thought she should have a lawyer present. They said, okay, stand up, you're under arrest.
Eve's arrest took her daughter and brother completely by surprise.
I was in total shock and really confused. And I just wanted answers like everyone else.
I was very confused without knowing if something had happened to Tim, let alone what that something was, how they could arrest her.
According to the prosecutor, the answer was probable cause.
Essentially, probable cause means that there is some level of evidence that suggests it's likely that the suspect committed a felony.
But not enough to justify a formal murder charge. At least, not yet.
They didn't have a lot of evidence. They didn't have a weapon. They didn't have a body.
For the next 7 days, the investigators worked to build a stronger case, while Eve's attorney tried to get her out of jail.
Her defense attorneys brought the matter before the judge, claiming her continued detention without charges was in fact a violation of her constitutional rights.
But even as her attorney tried to convince a judge to release her, Eve had an apparent change of heart. On November 27th, she told the investigators she was finally ready to talk.
She wanted to tell them what really happened.
As soon as Eve sat down with the investigators, she began to tell them what happened the last time she saw Tim.
There was an altercation at the house that night.
According to Eve, Tim was furious when she got home that night.
I came in, started arguing about where have I been. I should have been there when he got off work.
Eve said that's when she'd walked away from the argument.
I went to the bathroom. All I wanted to do was take the shower and go to bed. That's all I wanted. Then he comes in the bathroom and starts hitting me some more.
Her story was he showed up with a gun.
He had the gun. He's waving it around, telling me that I was useless and all kind of stuff. And I was just begging for him to just go. Just go.
But for all her begging, Eve said that Tim wouldn't leave.
He just kept hitting me and waving the gun, and then before I knew it, we were arguing and fighting, and the gun went off.
Why did it go off?
Because we both had it.
She was trying to get it away from him, and it went off.
I didn't know what to do. I sat back down for a little bit. You know, he wasn't moving.
How long was he in there?
I don't know. It seemed like forever.
Any thoughts of calling 911?
I couldn't think of anything. It's like
So,
I was paralyzed. I just sat there.
Eventually, Eve said that she did the only thing that she could think of.
I took all his clothes off, and then I put him in the plastic, and I drove, and I drove, and I drove.
Eve said in her panic she didn't remember exactly where she dumped Tim's body, but she gave police a general idea of where he might be.
I was down this like half a street, and there was one of those cement things.
Like a barrier?
That same evening, almost a month after he disappeared, the police finally found Tim's dead body buried in the snow.
His body was completely naked and was frozen.
It was heartbreaking to think of him out there for all that time.
Without Eve's confession, Tim's body might have remained undiscovered for months. But it also gave the police enough to charge her with murder, despite her claim that she'd shot Tim while they struggled over a gun.
I swear to you, it was an accident. Okay. I just wish he would have left.
And despite the fact that he had mistreated her, Eve said that Tim's death had left her heartbroken.
I just kept telling him how much I loved him, and that this is all a big mistake.
Coming up, the prosecution makes the case against Eve.
The prosecutor basically says it was an execution.
But the defense puts the victim on trial.
Tim was an aggressive person. He was a violent person.
On January 20th, 2016, 39-year-old Eve Nance stood trial in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. She was charged with the murder of her husband, Tim, a crime that she had essentially confessed to more than 2 years earlier.
Detectives with the City of Fond du Lac Police Department received information from Eve Nance indicating that she had been involved in an altercation with her husband at their 10th Street home, that a gun had been fired, and that it resulted in the death of Mr. Nance.
The person who was most helpful closing this case was Eve Nance herself. I'm not sure where investigators would be if they didn't have help from Eve.
Although at the time of her confession, Eve claimed that the shooting had occurred during a struggle.
Her story is that Tim had pulled out a gun. Both of them were fighting over it.
Eve stated that she was trying to defend herself.
But according to the prosecution's opening statement, that was a lie. And they claimed that the giveaway was something else in Eve's story.
According to Eve, the gun went off twice, and he was shot twice in the chest.
But as the prosecutors explained to the jury, that wasn't what Tim's autopsy revealed.
The associate medical examiner testified to the locations of the gunshot wounds in the head of Tim Nance, one being the left side below the ear, the other left side on the top of the head.
Not only did the locations of where Tim had been shot differ radically from Eve's account, according to the medical examiner's testimony, the shots couldn't have been fired during the sort of struggle she described.
The medical examiner testified on stand that the gun wounds could not have been fired at close range. The story really started to unravel when you looked at the case from the medical examiner.
Not only that, the prosecutors claimed that Eve had a clear motive for murder, too.
That motive was both anger and revenge for his infidelity.
Infidelity that everyone agreed had gone on for years.
This wasn't a crime of passion in the heat of the moment because Eve Nance's anger had been building up over a period of time.
In the past, Eve had always stopped short of doing something she would regret. But not on the evening of November 1st, 2013. According to the prosecutors, that night, Eve had finally had enough.
Prosecutors argued that this was no accident, that Tim was taking a shower and getting ready to go out for the evening.
And Eve, fed up with her husband's infidelity, had stepped into the bathroom and finally made good on years of threats.
I think that she came up behind him and put a bullet in the back of his head.
Prosecutor basically says it was an execution.
Shooting Tim in the shower not only explained why he'd been found naked. According to the prosecutors, the cold-blooded execution meant that Eve deserved to be sent away for life.
The first-degree intentional homicide charge carries a maximum penalty of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.
Based solely on the evidence, a conviction looked likely.
The medical examiner's testimony directly contradicted Eve Nance's account of the events.
But the prosecutors did face one big obstacle.
Timothy Nance was not a great individual to his wife. He was not a faithful individual.
Would the fact that he'd brazenly cheated on Eve for years, all while taking advantage of her financial support, be enough to earn the jury's sympathy?
She just loved her husband so much, and he didn't love her back the way she needed to be loved.
When it was the defense's turn, they began by claiming that Tim's cheating wasn't even the worst thing he'd done to Eve.
The defense presented their case that she was a battered woman.
Tim was an aggressive person. He was a violent person.
To bolster that argument, Eve took the stand in her own defense.
She got on the stand and tried to make him look like he was this kind of monster.
Eve told the jury that she was the frequent target of Tim's wrath.
My dad was the aggressor because he wanted things his way and kind of his way only.
He would start like yelling or just getting mad about just random stuff. But there were some times where like it would escalate while we were there. We've seen it get physical.
Family members testified that they'd often urged Eve to leave Tim, but that Eve had clung to the relationship despite the violence.
I was always worried that something would happen to her in one of their fights. When you don't know anything else, what you have right in front of you is what you learn to accept.
My aunt just didn't want to realize what was really happening, like she's kind of in like a fantasy thing.
But according to the defense, on the evening of November 1st, Eve couldn't deceive herself any longer because Tim had taken their arguments to a new and potentially deadly level.
The defense argued that he was the one that brought the gun into the situation.
And the stories from Tim's friends and ex-girlfriends describing all the times Eve had allegedly pulled a gun and threatened her husband. According to the defense, they simply weren't true.
No police officers had ever seen her with a gun. She had never been arrested in her life. She'd never been in any kind of trouble in her life.
But Tim, as the defense was quick to point out, had been in trouble. In fact, he'd actually shot someone early in the couple's relationship.
He spent time in prison.
That was hardly the only thing on his criminal record either.
He has different domestic abuse charges.
The police were called to their house for domestic issues numerous times.
And when the case went to the jury, the whole thing hinged on Eve's testimony. Would jurors believe she was a battered woman who killed her husband during a struggle to save herself?
A spouse that is a persistent victim of physical domestic abuse, at the time they commit a homicide, they're acting under a reasonable belief and fear for their own safety.
Or would they decide that it was Tim's cheating that had finally pushed her over the edge?
She just couldn't take it anymore. I definitely think it was intentional.
Coming up, Eve's fate hangs in the balance.
It really was a tale of two stories.
But will the outcome be justice?
If he didn't die from them 2 bullet wounds, Tim would have forgiven her.
On January 29, 2016, the jury announced it had reached a verdict in the murder trial of 39-year-old Eve Nance. She was accused of killing her husband, Tim, as revenge for years of adultery.
Prosecutors argued that Eve came in and point blank shot him, basically execution style.
But the defense said that Eve, not Tim, was the true victim. According to Eve and her lawyers, the shooting was merely the last incident in a long string of abuse that she'd suffered at her husband's hands.
Her defense was that they had an argument that turned into a physical fight.
There was a struggle over a gun, and the gun accidentally went off.
But which version of events would the jury believe?
It really was a tale of two stories.
After just 2 hours of deliberations, the jury had reached its decision.
The verdict came back guilty.
Eve was stunned by the outcome.
She was very sad. She couldn't believe that it only took them a couple of hours to convict her.
Eve's family and friends couldn't believe it either.
People that really do know Eve and Tim know that they loved each other.
In fact, at her sentencing on May 27th, many of Eve's friends said just that when they spoke on her behalf.
She cried a little bit, and you could tell that she was touched.
And when it was Eve's turn, she begged the court for mercy.
She said, all I can hope is that I would have the opportunity to have Pearl.
In a surprising twist, many of Tim's friends, including his ex-girlfriend, agreed that Eve didn't deserve life in prison.
Even I don't want to see her there because I don't believe that Tim would want that.
If he didn't die from them 2 bullet wounds, Tim would have forgiven her.
But would the judge be as forgiving?
She was given 25 years to life in prison with the possibility of parole.
His exact words were that this was not a planned crime, and it was a crime of passion.
And when it came to the possibility of Eve getting out of prison early, he felt that a certain amount of leniency was justified, given the circumstances.
I know what it feels like to love someone and lose control over your situation.
Love can make you put up with things that you would not expect, and love can make you possibly do things you would regret.
Raymond Fernandez did not need to break into a house in the middle of the night. He did not need to stalk strangers in the street or force his way into the lives of people who wanted nothing to do with him. He found them in a place where they were already looking for someone: the Lonely Hearts advertisements. These advertisements were created for people searching for companionship, affection, friendship, or the possibility of a lasting relationship. For someone reading them, an advertisement could represent something deeply ordinary, the hope that somewhere beyond the loneliness of everyday life, there might be another person willing to listen, to understand, and perhaps to share a future. For Raymond Fernandez, however, those advertisements became something else. They became a way to identify women who were looking for emotional connection, and in some cases, possess savings or property that could be exploited. The difference between what the victims believed they were beginning and what Fernandez intended was enormous. They were looking for a relationship. He was looking for an opportunity. In the years that followed, that deception would become associated with a series of deaths. Although the exact number of victims remains uncertain and must be treated carefully. Fernandez and Martha Beck were eventually convicted of only one murder: the killing of Janet Fay. Other deaths were suspected of being connected to them, and Fernandez himself initially claimed responsibility for numerous killings, sometimes giving a figure of 17 victims and, in later accounts, numbers approaching 20. But those claims were never established as 17 or 20 murder convictions. That distinction matters. It is easy, especially in a case that has become notorious, for an uncertain number to turn into a fact simply through repetition. But the story of the so-called Lonely Hearts Killers is disturbing enough without exaggeration. At its center was a man who learned how to use trust as an instrument. Raymond Martinez Fernandez was born in Hawaii in 1914. Before his relationship with Martha Beck, he already had a criminal history and had spent time in prison. His attention turned toward women responding to Lonely Hearts advertisements. The women who answered such advertisements were not necessarily suspicious of the people they met. They had entered the process voluntarily because they wanted companionship. Fernandez could present himself as a respectable and attentive man, someone interested in romance rather than exploitation. Once trust had been established, however, he could attempt to gain access to money or property. Some of these relationships would later be examined as possible parts of a much larger pattern. Then, in 1947, Martha Jewel Beck entered his life. Beck was approximately 26 or 27 years old. She had worked as a nurse and had managed a facility for children with disabilities in Florida. She had also been married and divorced and had 2 children. Like the women Fernandez targeted, Beck was searching for companionship. She turned to a club for lonely people, and one of the men who responded to her was Raymond Fernandez. At first, Fernandez intended to exploit Beck in much the same way he had exploited other women. But something changed. Beck became emotionally attached to him. Fernandez eventually revealed his fraudulent activities to her, exposing the reality behind the respectable image he presented to women who answered his advertisements. Beck now knew what he was doing. She knew that the relationships were not what they appeared to be. And yet she did not walk away. Instead, she joined him. From that point forward, the story was no longer simply about one man deceiving women. It became the story of a partnership. Fernandez and Beck discovered that appearing together could help create an appearance of normality. Beck could present herself as Fernandez's sister to a woman meeting Fernandez through a Lonely Hearts advertisement. The presence of another woman could make the situation appear less threatening. Fernandez was the man supposedly looking for love. Beck was the woman who appeared to be part of his ordinary family life. The image was reassuring. The reality was not. Their method depended upon something that cannot easily be measured as evidence: the victim's willingness to believe that the person in front of her was sincere. Fernandez could use romantic attention to establish trust. Beck could reinforce the impression that he was safe. Behind that appearance was a scheme involving deception and financial exploitation. But there was another element that would make their partnership even more dangerous. Martha Beck was intensely jealous. Fernandez needed the women he approached because they were the potential targets of his scheme. Beck, however, could regard those same women as rivals for Fernandez's affection. The contradiction was built into their relationship. The women were useful to Fernandez, but their closeness to him could provoke Beck. The man needed access to them. The woman who had joined him could become hostile toward them. It was a partnership in which deception, money, attachment, and jealousy became intertwined. That dynamic would eventually lead to one of the murders that brought the entire story into the open. Her name was Janet J. Fay. She was 66 years old. Like other women in this story, Fay believed that Fernandez might offer her a romantic relationship. She did not know that the man she trusted was connected to a scheme in which women could become targets. In early 1949, Fay went to the apartment in Long Island where Fernandez was staying. What happened there would ultimately become the central murder charge against Fernandez and Beck. According to the information surrounding the case, Beck discovered Fay in bed with Fernandez. A confrontation followed. The situation became violent. Fay was struck in the head, and Fernandez subsequently strangled her. Her body was concealed beneath concrete flooring in a Queens residence. On the night of March 1, 1949, police excavated the location and found her body. Fay had been bound, and a white cloth was around her neck. The examination revealed a fractured larynx as well as serious injuries to her head. The discovery transformed the case. What might previously have appeared to be a series of questionable relationships and suspected financial crimes now had a specific victim: a body and evidence of a violent death. Janet Fay was no longer simply a name connected to Fernandez's activities. She was a woman whose trust had been betrayed and whose death would eventually send both Fernandez and Beck to the electric chair. Yet the discovery of Fay's body would not reveal the full extent of the story. After her death, Fernandez and Beck left New York and traveled to Michigan. There, they would encounter another woman, another Lonely Hearts connection, and another tragedy. Her name was Delphine Downing. She was 28 years old, a widow, and the mother of a young daughter. And within days, The events surrounding Downing and her child would bring police directly to Fernandez and Beck. The investigation that followed would expose a story far larger than the murder of Janet Faye. It would also raise a question that would remain unresolved. How many victims had actually fallen into the world Fernandez and Beck had created? The answer could not simply be taken from a confession or a sensational number. Some deaths could be investigated. Some could be suspected. Some were connected to claims Fernandez himself later withdrew. But one fact was becoming impossible to ignore. Behind the promise of companionship was a pattern of deception. And behind that deception was violence. The women who answered those advertisements had been looking for someone to trust. They had no reason to believe that the person answering them might be studying their loneliness as an opportunity. That is what makes the story of Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck so unsettling. The danger did not begin with an obvious threat. It began with a message intended to bring two strangers closer together. The victims were not searching for danger. They were searching for connection. And somewhere inside those ordinary hopes, Raymond Fernandez had learned how to find them. The women who answered Lonely Hearts advertisements were searching for something ordinary. They were looking for companionship, affection, friendship, or the possibility of marriage. Nothing about that desire was unusual, and nothing about it made them responsible for what happened to them. Their vulnerability came from something deeply human, the willingness to believe that another person might be sincere. Raymond Fernandez understood that vulnerability and learned how to approach it. The Lonely Hearts advertisements gave him a point of contact with women who had already announced, in one form or another, that they were hoping to meet someone. Fernandez could enter their lives not as an intruder, but as a man who appeared to have the same goal. He could present himself as someone looking for a relationship. The women did not have to be persuaded to speak with him because the purpose of the advertisement had already created the opportunity. Fernandez only needed to step into the role they expected to meet. Behind that role, however, was a different intention. According to the information available about the case, Fernandez recognized that some women responding to these advertisements could be living alone and might possess savings or property that made the relationships useful to him in more than one way. Romance could create trust. Trust could create access. And access could provide an opportunity for financial exploitation. It is important, however, not to reduce every woman connected to Fernandez simply to the money she might have possessed. There were people first. Each relationship began with the possibility of companionship, while Fernandez approached it as part of a scheme. That difference between expectation and intention became the foundation of the entire case. Then Martha Jewel Beck entered Fernandez's life. In 1947, Beck was approximately 26 or 27 years old. She had worked as a nurse and had managed a facility for children with disabilities in Florida. She had been married and divorced, and she had 2 children. Like the women Fernandez would later approach, Beck herself was searching for companionship. She turned to a club for lonely people, and one of the men who responded to her was Fernandez. At first, Fernandez viewed Beck as another potential target. His intention was to exploit her in the same way he had exploited other women. But the relationship did not follow the pattern he expected. Beck became emotionally attached to him. Fernandez eventually revealed his fraudulent activities to her. At that moment, Beck knew that the man she had been communicating with was not simply a potential romantic partner. She knew there was deception behind his relationships with women, yet she did not leave. Instead, she joined him. That decision changed the structure of the scheme. Fernandez was no longer operating alone. Beck became part of the deception, and together they developed a way of presenting themselves that could make their victims less suspicious. They could appear to be something ordinary, a man and a woman traveling together, with a familial connection between them. Beck could present herself as Fernandez's sister. It was a simple explanation, but it had an important effect. A woman meeting a man through a Lonely Hearts advertisement might naturally have questions about the stranger she was considering as a romantic partner. The presence of another woman, introduced as his sister, could make the situation appear more familiar and less threatening. Fernandez was the man supposedly looking for love. Beck was the woman who appeared to belong to his family. Together, they could create an image of normality. That image was false. The danger in the arrangement was not only that Fernandez could deceive women. It was that Beck could help reinforce the deception. A victim who might have felt uncertain about Fernandez could see Beck as another person who seemed to know him and trust him. The relationship between Fernandez and Beck, therefore, became part of the mechanism through which other women were drawn closer. The false family was useful precisely because it appeared ordinary. But beneath that appearance was a partnership based on criminal deception. Fernandez continued to seek women through Lonely Hearts contacts. The relationships could provide opportunities for financial exploitation, while the presence of Beck helped create an atmosphere of trust. They moved between different locations, approaching women through personal advertisements and attempting to bring those women into situations that Fernandez and Beck could control. Yet their partnership contained a contradiction that would become increasingly important. Fernandez needed the women he approached. Beck did not want them. Her feelings toward Fernandez were not detached or merely practical. She was deeply attached to him and intensely jealous of the women who entered his life. Fernandez could view a woman as a potential target, but Beck could view the same woman as a rival. That difference created tension inside the partnership. Fernandez's relationships with other women were part of the mechanism that allowed the scheme to continue. For Beck, those relationships could represent a threat to the bond she believed she shared with Fernandez. The women were therefore caught between two different dangers. Fernandez saw them through the lens of exploitation. Beck could see them through the lens of jealousy. The combination was particularly dangerous because both motives could operate at the same time. When Fernandez approached a woman, he could be thinking about what he might gain from the relationship. When Beck observed that relationship, she could be thinking about Fernandez's attention and whether it was being given to someone else. This created a cycle in which emotional manipulation and criminal exploitation were connected. It would eventually contribute to the circumstances surrounding Janet Faye. Faye was 66 years old and believed that Fernandez might be someone with whom she could develop a romantic relationship. Like the other women connected to the Lonely Hearts system, she had entered the relationship because she believed it offered the possibility of companionship. But when Faye encountered Fernandez and Beck, the false image of safety began to collapse. Beck's jealousy became central to the confrontation that followed. According to the supplied information, Beck discovered Faye in bed with Fernandez. The discovery led to a violent confrontation. Faye was struck in the head, and Fernandez subsequently strangled her. Her body was concealed beneath concrete flooring in a Queens residence. The significance of Faye's death would become clear only after investigators found her body on the night of March 1, 1949. But the story surrounding Faye was not isolated. Fernandez and Beck had already established a pattern in which Lonely Hearts advertisements created the initial connection. Fernandez used romantic trust as part of his deception, and Beck participated in maintaining the appearance of normality. By the time Faye entered the story, the relationship between the two offenders had become inseparable from the danger faced by their targets. The case is sometimes remembered primarily through the name Lonely Hearts Killers. But that label can obscure the people at the center of the story. The women Fernandez approached were not simply entries in a criminal record. They were individuals who believed that another person might bring companionship into their lives. Their desire to find someone was exploited against them. The tragedy was not that they trusted too easily. The tragedy was that someone deliberately presented himself as worthy of that trust. Martha Beck's role makes the story even more complicated. She was not merely a passive observer who happened to be present when Fernandez deceived women. She learned about his fraudulent activities and chose to participate. She became part of the false identity that helped the pair move through the lives of other women. At the same time, her jealousy created another source of danger. particularly when Fernandez's attention appeared to shift toward the women he targeted. The result was a partnership in which the personal and criminal were almost impossible to separate. Fernandez's deception depended upon emotional trust. Beck's participation helped sustain the appearance that everything was normal. And the victims, unaware of the reality behind that appearance, entered relationships believing they were moving toward companionship rather than danger. Janet Faye would become the murder that finally brought the pair before a court. But before that happened, another woman and her young daughter would enter their path in Michigan. Delphine Downing was 28 years old, a widow, and a mother. Her encounter with Fernandez and Beck would become one of the most consequential episodes in the investigation. It would lead to their arrest, expose the existence of a much larger suspected pattern, and force investigators to confront the difference between what Fernandez claimed and what could actually be proven. By then, the false family had already begun to unravel. The appearance of normality that Fernandez and Beck had constructed could not survive the discovery of dead bodies. The Lonely Hearts advertisements had opened the door, but the investigation would soon begin closing it behind them. Janet Fay, the name Janet J. Faye would eventually become inseparable from the case of Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck. She was 66 years old, and like the other women drawn into Fernandez's orbit, she believed she was entering a relationship with a man who might offer companionship and affection. There was nothing inherently unusual about that hope. She had responded to the same kind of Lonely Hearts connection that had brought other women into Fernandez's life. From her perspective, the relationship was personal. From Fernandez's perspective, according to the information surrounding the case, these relationships could be part of a broader pattern of deception and financial exploitation. The difference between those two realities is essential to understanding what happened next. Janet Faye did not know that the man she trusted had been using Lonely Hearts advertisements to identify women who might become targets. She did not know that Martha Beck had joined Fernandez and was participating in the deception. She did not know that Beck often presented herself as Fernandez's sister, creating the appearance of a familiar and trustworthy family connection. And she could not have known how dangerous the relationship between Fernandez and Beck had become. By early 1949, Fernandez and Beck were operating together. Their partnership was built on deception, but it was also complicated by Beck's intense jealousy. Fernandez needed women to believe that his interest in them was genuine. Beck, however, could regard those same women as rivals for Fernandez's attention. The contradiction was becoming increasingly dangerous. A woman could be useful to Fernandez because of the opportunity she represented, while simultaneously becoming a source of anger for Beck because of the relationship she appeared to have with him. Janet Faye became caught inside that contradiction. In early 1949, Faye went to the apartment in Long Island where Fernandez was staying. She believed that she was meeting a man with whom she could potentially develop a romantic relationship. Instead, she entered an environment in which the relationship between Fernandez and Beck was about to become violently exposed. According to the supplied information, Beck discovered Faye in bed with Fernandez. That discovery triggered a confrontation. The exact words spoken during the confrontation are not provided in the available material, so there is no reliable dialogue to reproduce. What is known is that the confrontation became violent. Faye was struck in the head. Fernandez subsequently strangled her. The violence that followed was not simply the end of a romantic encounter. It was the destruction of a woman who had entered the relationship believing she was safe. The circumstances surrounding Faye's death would later become the central murder case against both Fernandez and Beck. After Faye was killed, her body was concealed beneath concrete flooring in a Queens residence. The concealment itself created another layer of deception. The woman who had disappeared was no longer simply absent. Her body had been hidden from view, placed beneath a surface intended to prevent discovery. For the people who knew Faye, her disappearance would have raised questions. But for investigators, the decisive moment would come when the hidden body was eventually found. On the night of March 1st, 1949, police excavated the location in Queens. Beneath the concrete, they discovered Faye's body. The discovery transformed the nature of the case. Until that point, the broader activities associated with Fernandez and Beck could be described in terms of suspicious relationships, deception, and suspected financial exploitation. Now there was a specific victim and a confirmed violent death. The physical condition of Faye's body provided evidence about what had happened to her. She had been bound, and a white cloth was found around her neck. The examination revealed a fractured larynx and serious injuries to her head. Those findings were consistent with the violence already known to investigators. Faye had been struck and strangled. The discovery also gave the authorities a concrete case around which a prosecution could be built. This distinction would become extremely important later. Fernandez and Beck were suspected of being connected to other deaths. Fernandez himself would make extraordinary claims about numerous victims. But suspicion was not the same as proof, and a confession was not necessarily enough to establish every crime. Janet Faye was different. Her body had been found. Her death could be investigated as a specific homicide, and the circumstances surrounding her death could be examined in court. The case against Fernandez and Beck would eventually focus on this murder. But the discovery of Faye's body did not immediately answer every question. Investigators still faced a much larger mystery. How many women had encountered Fernandez through Lonely Hearts advertisements? How many had been financially exploited? How many had disappeared? And how many deaths, if any, could actually be connected to Fernandez and Beck? These questions would become even more significant after the pair left New York. According to the supplied information, after Faye's death, Fernandez and Beck traveled to Michigan. Their movement from New York to Michigan did not erase what had happened. Instead, it placed them in another situation that would soon bring the entire investigation to a critical turning point. In Michigan, they encountered Delphine Downing, a 28-year-old widow with a young daughter. Downing was another woman who became connected to the pair, and the events that followed would lead directly to their arrest. The timing was crucial. Faye's body was discovered on March 1st, 1949, but the events surrounding Downing were already unfolding. On February 28th, according to the supplied information, Fernandez gave Downing medication that caused her to become unconscious. While Downing was incapacitated, her young daughter began crying. At that point, the situation escalated dramatically. Beck lost control. The child was killed. Downing was subsequently shot. The two bodies were then hidden in the basement of the house. The death of the child is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case because she had no connection to the original search for companionship that had brought adults into Fernandez and Beck's orbit. She was simply a young child caught in a situation created by adults. The supplied information does not provide enough detail to reconstruct her final moments, and the script will not invent such details. What can be stated is that her death represented a horrifying escalation of the violence associated with the pair. The story that had begun with Lonely Hearts advertisements and adult relationships had now reached a young child who had no role in the deception. Delphine Downing's death and the death of her daughter would become the immediate circumstances, leading investigators toward Fernandez and Beck. Their disappearance could not remain unexplained. Suspicion grew around the house, and on March 1st, 1949, police arrived. Fernandez and Beck were arrested. Investigators found the bodies hidden in the basement, turning the case into a homicide investigation. The discovery would also begin to expose the larger patterns surrounding the couple. Fernandez began talking to investigators, and what he said suggested that Janet Faye's death might not have been an isolated event. He claimed responsibility for numerous killings. One figure associated with his confession was 17 victims. Other accounts later placed the number closer to 20. But this is where the story requires caution. The number was not equivalent to a list of proven murders. Fernandez later retracted some or all of his confession, explaining that he had made statements in an effort to protect Beck and for reasons connected to the circumstances surrounding the case. As a result, the investigation entered a difficult territory. Investigators had a confession, but they also had to determine which parts could be supported by evidence. Some deaths could be suspected. Others might have been connected to Fernandez and Beck through circumstances that appeared troubling. But not every alleged killing could be proven. This distinction would eventually determine the limits of the prosecution. Janet Faye remained the central murder charge because her death could be established as a specific homicide and presented in court. The wider claims surrounding 17 or 20 victims became part of the history and notoriety of the case. But they could not simply be converted into convictions. That difference is crucial when remembering Faye. She should not disappear beneath the larger legend of the Lonely Hearts Killers. Her name represents a confirmed victim whose death became the foundation of the prosecution. She was a 66-year-old woman who believed she was pursuing companionship. Instead, she became the victim of a violent confrontation involving two people she had reason to trust. Her body was hidden beneath concrete, but the attempt to conceal her death failed. When police discovered her on the night of March 1st, the false world that Fernandez and Beck had constructed began to collapse. Their advertisements, their romantic identities, and their carefully maintained appearance of normality could no longer hide the reality beneath them. Yet the discovery of Faye's body raised a question rather than answering one. Was this one murder, or only one part of something much larger? Fernandez's own statements would make that question even more difficult. The investigation was about to move beyond one hidden body and into a maze of confessions, suspicions, disputed claims, and unanswered deaths. For the authorities, the challenge was no longer simply to find out whether Fernandez and Beck had killed Janet Faye. It was to determine what could actually be proven about everything else they might have done. And that distinction between suspicion and evidence, between confession and proof, would shape the next stage of the case. The discovery of Janet Faye's body on the night of March 1st, 1949, gave investigators a confirmed homicide connected to Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck. But at almost the same moment, another part of the story was already unfolding in Michigan. There, Fernandez and Beck had encountered Delphine Downing, a 28-year-old widow and mother of a young daughter. Her name would become one of the most important in the investigation, not because her death was the murder for which Fernandez and Beck were ultimately tried, but because the circumstances surrounding her disappearance and the disappearance of her child helped lead police directly to the couple. The events surrounding Downing were also a dramatic escalation in the violence associated with Fernandez and Beck. Their earlier activities had centered on deception, romantic manipulation, and financial exploitation. With Downing, the situation moved into a sequence involving a woman, a child, and two concealed bodies. The details of what happened are disturbing, but the available information places clear limits on what can responsibly be said. On February 28, 1949, according to the evidence and testimony later described in connection with the case, Fernandez gave Downing medication that caused her to become unconscious. The reason for doing so is not fully established in the supplied material, and it would be inappropriate to invent one. What is known is that Downing became incapacitated while her young daughter remained present in the house. The child began crying. At that point, Martha Beck lost control. The situation became fatal. The young girl was killed. Downing was subsequently shot. Their bodies were then hidden in the basement of the house. The significance of this moment extends beyond the immediate deaths. The little girl was not a participant in the Lonely Hearts relationships that had brought Fernandez into contact with women. She had not answered an advertisement. She had not entered a romantic relationship with him. She was simply a child who happened to be present. Her death demonstrated how quickly the violence surrounding Fernandez and Beck could expand beyond the people they originally encountered. The supplied information does not provide enough evidence to reconstruct the child's final moments or to describe her thoughts. And the responsible approach is not to fill those gaps with imagined details. What can be established is that the child's crying became part of the crisis. Beck reacted violently, and the child was killed. Downing was then shot, and both bodies were concealed beneath the house. For Fernandez and Beck, concealment was now part of the pattern. In New York, Janet Faye's body had been hidden beneath concrete flooring. In Michigan, the bodies of Downing and her daughter were hidden in the basement. The physical concealment could delay discovery, but it could not erase the fact that two people had disappeared. A house can appear ordinary from the outside, even when something terrible has happened inside it. A basement can contain evidence that no one passing on the street would ever see. But disappearances create questions. People notice when someone is no longer present. And in the case of Delphine Downing and her daughter, those questions eventually brought police to the house. On March 1, 1949, investigators arrived. The discovery of the bodies changed everything. What had previously been a complicated story of romantic deception and suspected financial crimes had become an investigation involving multiple deaths. Fernandez and Beck were arrested. The authorities now had a direct connection between the couple and a house containing the bodies of a woman and her child. But they still did not possess the full story. The investigation was only beginning. One of the most important developments came from Fernandez himself. After his arrest, he began talking to investigators. His statements opened a much larger and more complicated picture. Fernandez claimed that he had killed numerous women. One figure associated with his initial confession was 17 victims. Other accounts later placed the number around 20. For investigators, such a confession could not simply be treated as a complete and unquestionable account of every murder. A person can confess to crimes that cannot be independently verified, and Fernandez later withdrew some or all of his statements. According to the supplied information, he explained that he had confessed in an effort to protect Martha Beck, or because of circumstances surrounding the prosecution. This created a fundamental problem. If Fernandez had really killed many women, investigators needed to determine which deaths could be connected to him through evidence. If his confession contained exaggerations or false statements, then the number of victims could not be accepted merely because it had come from his own mouth. The distinction would become central to the historical record of the case. Fernandez and Beck were sometimes described as responsible for 17 or even 20 murders, but they were not convicted of 17 or 20 murders. They were ultimately convicted of one, the murder of Janet Faye. That fact should not be lost beneath the sensational claims surrounding the case. The deaths of Delphine Downing and her daughter were critical to the investigation, but the prosecution that eventually resulted in death sentences centered on Faye's murder. The Downing case instead functioned as a major investigative turning point. It placed Fernandez and Beck in police custody and exposed a hidden world that investigators had not previously understood in its entirety. It also created the opportunity to examine Fernandez's statements and compare them with other evidence. As investigators learned more, the story of the Lonely Hearts advertisements became increasingly disturbing. Fernandez had used those advertisements to find women seeking companionship. He had presented himself as a potential romantic partner. Beck had joined him and often presented herself as his sister, reinforcing an appearance of normality. Their targets could believe they were entering an ordinary relationship. Yet behind that appearance was a scheme involving deception and financial exploitation, and in some cases suspected violence. The discovery of Downing and her daughter meant that investigators could no longer view the matter simply as a series of isolated disappearances or suspicious relationships. There were now bodies, suspects, and a confession pointing toward additional crimes. But the confession itself created as many questions as it answered. If Fernandez was telling the truth, where were the other victims? If he was exaggerating, which parts of his account could be trusted? And if he was changing his story to protect Beck? How much of what he said had been shaped by his relationship with her? These questions were especially important because Fernandez and Beck were not merely strangers who happened to become involved in the same criminal case. Their relationship was central to everything that had happened. Beck had learned about Fernandez's fraudulent activities and chosen to remain with him. She had become his accomplice. Her jealousy had also been an important factor in the dangerous relationships Fernandez maintained. With women he approached, the events surrounding Janet Faye had already shown how that jealousy could become violent. The events surrounding Downing and her daughter showed something even more disturbing. The consequences could reach people beyond the original targets. By the time police arrested Fernandez and Beck, the image they had constructed had collapsed. The supposed family relationship, the romantic introductions, and the appearance of ordinary companionship could no longer conceal what investigators had found. The basement of the Downing house had become evidence of violence, just as the concealed remains of Janet Faye had exposed what happened in Queens. Yet the investigators were still facing a problem that would follow the case into the courtroom. There was a difference between knowing that Fernandez and Beck were involved in horrific events and being able to prove a particular murder beyond the required legal standard. The Downing investigation raised suspicions about a larger pattern. Fernandez's confession appeared to confirm that suspicion, but later retractions made the confession less straightforward. The authorities therefore had to separate what they believed might have happened from what they could establish through evidence. That distinction is one of the most important aspects of the entire case. It prevents the story from becoming a simple legend about two people who supposedly killed 20 victims. The historical record is more complicated. There were confirmed deaths. There were suspected connections. There were allegations and confessions. And there were claims that could not be independently established. The lives of Delphine Downing and her daughter belong to the most tragic part of that story because their deaths became a direct bridge between the hidden crimes and the investigation that followed. Their disappearance could not remain concealed. Once police entered the house and discovered the bodies, Fernandez and Beck could no longer move freely through the world they had created. Their arrest brought investigators closer to the truth, but it also opened a much larger question about their past. Fernandez had begun talking. The number of alleged victims was growing, and the authorities now had to determine which parts of his story were fact, which were suspicion, and which could be proven. The case had moved from a hidden murder in Queens to a wider investigation spanning multiple relationships and deaths. But the next stage would be even more complicated. Fernandez's statements would draw attention to other possible victims, while the prosecution would ultimately have to narrow the case down to something that could survive in court. The story was becoming larger, but the evidence had to become more precise. And that tension between the scale of the allegations and the limits of what could actually be proven would define the investigation that followed. A story larger than one murder after Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck were arrested on March 1, 1949. Investigators were no longer dealing with a single suspicious relationship or an isolated disappearance. They had uncovered the bodies of Delphine Downing and her young daughter, and they already knew that Janet J. Faye had been found dead in Queens. The two cases were separated by location, but they were connected by the same two people. Fernandez and Beck had moved from one place to another, and the investigation now had to determine what exactly had happened wherever they had been. The immediate problem was evidence. Investigators had bodies. They had suspects. They had a history of deception surrounding Lonely Hearts advertisements. But they also had a much larger question. Were these deaths isolated events, or were they part of a wider pattern? Fernandez himself appeared to provide an answer. After his arrest, he began speaking to investigators. His statements were extraordinary. He claimed responsibility for numerous killings, with one frequently cited figure being 17 victims. Other accounts later placed the number at around 20. If taken literally, such a confession would have transformed the case from a murder investigation into the exposure of a large-scale killing operation. But investigators could not simply accept every statement as established fact. The larger the confession became, the more important verification became. A confession can direct investigators toward evidence, but the confession itself does not automatically prove every crime mentioned within it. This distinction would become one of the defining issues in the history of Fernandez and Beck. At first, Fernandez's statements appeared to offer an explanation for the pattern that investigators had begun to suspect. Women had met him through Lonely Hearts advertisements. He had presented himself as a potential romantic partner. Some women had money or property. Beck had joined him and helped create an appearance of normality by presenting herself as his sister. The couple moved between locations, and their relationships with women could become opportunities for financial exploitation. Now Fernandez was claiming that the consequences had sometimes been fatal. But as investigators examined the claims, another problem emerged. Not every alleged victim could be established through sufficient evidence. Some deaths could be suspected of having a connection to Fernandez and Beck. Others appeared only in the context of Fernandez's own statements. And Fernandez later retracted some or all of his confession. That reversal fundamentally changed the way the statements had to be understood. According to the supplied information, Fernandez explained that he had made the confession in an effort to protect Martha Beck, or because of circumstances surrounding where and how the case was being prosecuted. Whatever his precise reason, the result was the same. Investigators could not simply treat his first account as an unquestionable record of 17 or 20 murders. His words had to be separated from facts that could independently be demonstrated. That distinction is easy to lose when a case becomes famous. Numbers have a powerful effect on public memory. 17 victims is a striking phrase. 20 victims sounds even more horrifying. Once repeated often enough, such numbers can become attached permanently to the names of the accused. But the legal history was much narrower. Fernandez and Beck were ultimately prosecuted and convicted for the murder of Janet Faye. They were not convicted of 17 murders. They were not convicted of 20 murders. The broader number belongs to the realm of allegations, suspicions, and Fernandez's own statements, not to a list of murder convictions. Investigators therefore faced two different tasks. The first was to understand the larger patterns surrounding Fernandez and Beck. The second was to establish a particular murder with evidence strong enough to withstand a trial. Those tasks were related, but they were not identical. The discovery of Faye's body provided a specific homicide. Her body had been found beneath concrete flooring in a Queens residence. She had been bound. A white cloth had been found around her neck, and the examination revealed a fractured larynx and serious head injuries. Those facts created a concrete evidentiary foundation. The circumstances surrounding her death could be examined separately from the uncertain claims about other victims. Janet Faye therefore became the center of the prosecution. The Downing case remained crucial to the investigation because it had helped bring Fernandez and Beck into custody and had exposed the possibility of a wider pattern. But when the time came to determine what could be proven in court, the prosecution focused on Faye. The investigation also had to account for the relationship between Fernandez and Beck. Their partnership was not simply a matter of two people being in the same place at the same time. Beck had learned about Fernandez's fraudulent activities and had chosen to participate. She had become part of the false identity that surrounded him. Presenting herself as his sister helped create the impression that Fernandez was an ordinary man, whose life included a familiar family connection. For a woman meeting him through a Lonely Hearts advertisement, that appearance could reduce suspicion. It could make the encounter seem safer. Investigators, therefore, had to examine not only what Fernandez had done, but what role Beck had played in the scheme and in the events surrounding Faye's death. Beck's jealousy was also important to understanding the circumstances. Fernandez needed women as part of his method of deception. Beck regarded those women as potential rivals. The relationship between them, therefore, contained an internal conflict. Fernandez's attention toward women was useful to his scheme, but that same attention could provoke Beck. The events involving Janet Faye demonstrated how dangerous that conflict could become. According to the supplied information, Beck discovered Faye in bed with Fernandez. A confrontation followed. Faye was struck in the head, and Fernandez subsequently strangled her. Her body was concealed beneath concrete. This sequence became central to the prosecution because it connected the relationship between Fernandez and Beck to a specific death. But even with this evidence, investigators and prosecutors had to resist the temptation to let the larger allegations determine the smaller legal question. The case was notorious because of the possibility of numerous victims. The prosecution, however, still needed to prove a particular crime. This explains why the investigation did not simply become a courtroom presentation of every murder. Fernandez had claimed some alleged victims could not be established with sufficient evidence. Some deaths were only suspected. Some appeared in Fernandez's initial confession and then became uncertain after he withdrew or changed his account. The distinction between these categories became essential. There were deaths that could be investigated. There were deaths that raised serious suspicions. And there were deaths that could not be established as crimes committed by Fernandez and Beck merely because Fernandez had mentioned them. The investigation, therefore, became an exercise in separating certainty from uncertainty. In a sensational case, the temptation is always to assemble every unexplained death into one narrative. But responsible investigation requires the opposite approach. Each death has to stand on its own evidence. Each connection must be tested. Each confession must be considered in light of independent facts. The Fernandez and Beck investigation demonstrated how difficult that process could become when one of the suspects provided a dramatic but changeable account. Fernandez's confession helped make the case notorious, but it also complicated the historical record. If his first statement had been accepted without question, the story would have been simple. Two people had killed 17 or 20 victims. But the later retraction prevented such certainty. The investigators were left with a more complicated picture. They had confirmed deaths and strong suspicions, but not enough evidence to turn every allegation into a conviction. This is why the murder of Janet Faye remains so important. Faye was not merely one name among many. She was the victim whose death provided the specific criminal case that could be taken to trial. Her body had been found. The injuries had been documented. The circumstances surrounding her final encounter with Fernandez and Beck could be examined. And the relationship between the two defendants could be presented as part of the prosecution's account of what had happened. The investigation had therefore reached an important transition. The police had moved from discovery to reconstruction. They had to determine not merely whether Fernandez and Beck were dangerous, but how their actions could be connected to a specific murder. The larger mystery remained unresolved. How many women had actually been victimized? How many had lost money or property? How many deaths were truly connected to the couple? The answers would never become as certain as the sensational numbers suggested. Yet one fact was increasingly clear. Janet Faye had died violently, and the evidence surrounding her death was strong enough to place Fernandez and Beck at the center of a murder prosecution. By the time the investigation moved toward trial, the authorities had to leave some of the larger questions unanswered. They could not bring every suspected death into court simply because it formed part of the story. The prosecution had to concentrate on what could be established. That meant the case would become narrower than the legend surrounding it. The public might hear about 17 victims, perhaps 20, but the courtroom would ultimately focus on one woman, Janet Faye. And that difference between the legend and the evidence would define everything that followed. The investigation had uncovered a disturbing world in which Lonely Hearts advertisements, romantic deception, financial exploitation, jealousy, and violence had become intertwined. But the next test would take place somewhere far more controlled, the courtroom. There, Fernandez and Beck would no longer be judged simply by the stories surrounding their names or by the number of murders attributed to them. They would have to answer for a specific death, and the prosecution would have to prove their responsibility for it. The question was no longer how frightening the larger story might be. The question was whether the evidence surrounding Janet Faye was strong enough to produce a conviction. By the summer of 1949, the investigation into Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck had reached the courtroom. The story surrounding the two defendants was already larger than the charge they were facing. Newspapers and investigators had connected them with Lonely Hearts advertisements, financial deception, suspicious deaths, and Fernandez's extraordinary confession claiming numerous victims. Yet the legal case itself had to be much more precise. Fernandez and Beck were being tried for the murder of Janet J. Faye. That distinction would define the proceedings. The prosecution could not simply ask the jury to consider every allegation surrounding the couple and then reach a conclusion based on the overall impression. The central question was whether the evidence established that Fernandez and Beck were responsible for Faye's death. Janet Faye was 66 years old. She had believed that Fernandez was a man with whom she could pursue a romantic relationship. Her journey into his life had begun in the same general world of Lonely Hearts advertisements that Fernandez had learned to exploit. The prosecution's task was to show the jury how that relationship ended in violence and how both defendants were connected to the killing. The evidence surrounding Faye's death provided a concrete foundation. Her body had been concealed beneath concrete flooring in a Queens residence. When police excavated the location on March 1st, 1949, they discovered her body bound with a white cloth around her neck. The examination revealed a fractured larynx and serious injuries to her head. Those physical findings were important because they provided objective evidence that Faye had died violently. The case was not based solely on a missing person report or on an accusation made by one defendant against another. There was a body, there were injuries, and there was a specific location where her remains had been concealed. The prosecution also had the circumstances surrounding the relationship between Faye, Fernandez, and Beck. According to the supplied information, Beck discovered Faye in bed with Fernandez. A confrontation followed. Faye was struck in the head, and Fernandez subsequently strangled her. The body was then hidden. The prosecution could use this sequence to present the death as the result of a violent confrontation rather than an unexplained disappearance. Beck's role was especially significant. She was not simply a witness who happened to be present. She had knowingly joined Fernandez after learning about his fraudulent activities. She had participated in the deception surrounding his relationships with women. She had also been intensely jealous of the women Fernandez approached. This background helped explain why Faye could become the focus of a violent confrontation. The prosecution, therefore, had to connect Beck not only to Fernandez, but to the circumstances that led to Faye's death. At the same time, the defense faced a difficult environment. The public story surrounding the defendants was already sensational. Fernandez had reportedly confessed to numerous murders, at one point giving a figure of 17 victims. Other accounts later placed the number around 20. But Fernandez subsequently withdrew some or all of his confession, claiming that he had made statements to protect Beck or because of circumstances connected with the case. This created a complicated situation for the trial. The defense could challenge the reliability of Fernandez's statements, while the prosecution could still use the circumstances of the Faye murder and the broader relationship between the defendants to establish responsibility. Fernandez himself changed his account. He denied responsibility in the manner the prosecution described and attempted to explain his earlier statements as something other than a straightforward admission of guilt. His shifting statements created an important issue for the jury. Which version of Fernandez's story should be believed? More fundamentally, should his statements be considered at all in determining what had happened to Faye? The jury had to evaluate the evidence rather than simply accept the most dramatic version of the story. Martha Beck's defense also focused on her psychological condition and her relationship with Fernandez. Her attorneys attempted to portray her as someone suffering from serious psychological problems and as a person who had been influenced by Fernandez. The defense sought to create a distinction between Beck's participation in the broader scheme and her criminal responsibility for Faye's death. But the prosecution presented the relationship differently. Beck had learned what Fernandez was doing. She had not left him. She had joined him. She had participated in the deception that surrounded his relationships with women, and her jealousy was relevant to the confrontation involving Faye. The jury, therefore, had to decide whether Beck's actions and state of mind amounted to criminal responsibility for the murder. Another unusual aspect of the trial involved legal representation. Fernandez and Beck were represented by the same lawyer. The arrangement was later criticized on ethical and legal grounds because two defendants in a murder case can have interests that conflict. If one defendant attempts to place responsibility on the other, a shared attorney may face a difficult position. Fernandez's changing statements and Beck's effort to portray herself as influenced by him created precisely the kind of tension that made their joint representation controversial. Nevertheless, the trial proceeded. The prosecution presented its case around the death of Janet Faye rather than attempting to prove every suspected murder associated with the couple. This was important because the larger narrative was much more difficult to establish than the Faye murder itself. The authorities might suspect Fernandez and Beck in other deaths, and Fernandez might claim responsibility for them, but the prosecution could not treat every allegation as an established fact. The courtroom, therefore, became the place where the boundaries of the case were drawn. The jury was not being asked to decide whether Fernandez and Beck were generally dangerous people. It was being asked to determine whether they were guilty of the specific murder charged. The distinction between moral judgment and legal judgment was crucial. The case had already generated public fascination because of the idea of lonely hearts, advertisements being used to find victims. But the legal process required something more concrete. The prosecution had to demonstrate responsibility for Faye's death through admissible evidence and testimony. The defense, meanwhile, could challenge the prosecution's interpretation and attempt to create reasonable doubt. Yet the evidence surrounding Faye created a powerful narrative. She had entered a relationship with Fernandez, believing she was seeking companionship. She encountered Beck, who was intensely jealous of Fernandez's relationships with other women. A confrontation occurred. Faye was beaten and strangled. Her body was concealed beneath concrete. Police later found her remains. These facts gave the prosecution a clear sequence to present to the jury. The defense could dispute responsibility, but it could not erase the existence of the body or the injuries that showed how Faye died. The trial also exposed the larger contradiction at the heart of the defendants' relationship. Fernandez had used romance as a tool of deception. Beck had joined him, but her emotional attachment to him created a different kind of instability. She wanted Fernandez for herself. The women he approached were necessary to his scheme, yet they could also become targets of Beck's jealousy. Faye's death illustrated the destructive result of that conflict. The trial, therefore, became more than a question of who had physically caused the injuries. It was also an examination of the relationship between two people whose partnership had turned deception into a shared activity. The defense attempted to complicate that picture by focusing on Beck's psychological condition and Fernandez's changing statements. But the jury ultimately rejected the argument that either defendant should escape responsibility for Faye's death. On August 18, 1949, the case went to the jury. The jurors deliberated overnight. Their task was to determine whether the evidence established first-degree murder. The following decision would end the uncertainty of the trial. The jury found Raymond Fernandez guilty of first-degree murder. Martha Beck was also found guilty of first-degree murder. Both were sentenced to death. The verdict was significant not only because it ended the trial, but because it established the legal boundary of the case. Fernandez and Beck had been associated with numerous suspected deaths, but the convictions were for Janet Faye's murder. The jury did not turn the allegations of 17 or 20 victims into 17 or 20 murder convictions. It decided the specific case presented before it for Faye's family and those who had known her. The verdict represented a legal acknowledgement that her death was not an unsolved disappearance. Her body had been found beneath concrete, but the attempt to conceal her death had failed. The people responsible had been identified, prosecuted, and convicted. Yet the verdict did not resolve every question surrounding Fernandez and Beck. The allegations about other women remained. Fernandez's confession remained controversial because of his later retraction. The number of possible victims remained uncertain, and the exact extent of the couple's criminal activities could not be reconstructed with the certainty that a courtroom conviction requires. What the verdict established was narrower, but decisive. Both Fernandez and Beck were criminally responsible for the murder of Janet Faye. The courtroom had therefore reduced a sprawling and sensational investigation to one proven crime. That may seem anticlimactic when compared with the stories of 17 or 20 victims, but in a legal sense it was essential. Justice cannot be based on the size of a legend. It has to rest on evidence. The trial demonstrated that distinction. The public might remember the couple as the Lonely Hearts Killers, but the jury had been asked to decide the fate of one particular victim. Janet Faye was the woman whose death brought the strongest case against them. When the verdict was delivered, the final chapter of their lives had effectively been determined. They would not return to the world where they had met women through advertisements and presented false identities. Instead, they would enter Sing Sing prison, where they would remain on death row until their executions nearly 2 years later. The relationship that had helped create the crime would continue even behind prison walls. They would write to each other. They would continue to express their attachment. And eventually, on March 8, 1951, both would be taken to the electric chair. But before that final day, the case still had one more chapter: the years on death row. The continuing questions about the victims who might never be fully identified, and the enduring problem of separating what Fernandez and Beck were proven to have done from what history has suspected they might have done. After the verdict, the legal case against Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck had reached its decisive conclusion. The jury had found both defendants guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Janet J. Faye, and both were sentenced to death. But the public story surrounding the couple was still much larger than the conviction itself. The names Fernandez and Beck had become associated with Lonely Hearts advertisements, deception, jealousy, suspected financial exploitation, and the claims of numerous additional killings. Yet the verdict had established only one murder beyond the legal standard required for conviction: the killing of Janet Faye. That distinction remained important as the two defendants entered the final stage of their lives. Fernandez and Beck were transferred to Sing Sing prison, where they were held separately on death row. The distance between them did not end their relationship. According to the supplied information, they continued to write to one another, maintaining their emotional attachment even after the trial had ended. Their relationship had begun with a Lonely Hearts connection, developed into a partnership in deception, and ultimately became part of a murder case. Now, behind prison walls, it continued through letters. There is something striking about that final stage of the story. The partnership that had helped draw other women into danger did not disappear when the courtroom doors closed. Fernandez and Beck remained connected to one another while waiting for the sentence to be carried out. Yet their personal attachment should not overshadow the people who had suffered because of their actions. The most important figure in the case remained Janet Faye, the woman whose death had been proven in court. She had entered Fernandez's life believing that she was pursuing companionship. She became the victim of a violent confrontation and was then hidden beneath concrete. Her death was not a rumor or an unverified confession. It was the crime for which Fernandez and Beck were convicted. The wider mystery remained. Fernandez had initially claimed responsibility for numerous killings. The number most frequently associated with his confession was 17, although other accounts later suggested approximately 20. Those figures became central to the legends surrounding the couple. But as the investigation and prosecution demonstrated, a claim is not automatically a proven fact. Fernandez later withdrew some or all of his confession. He said that he had made statements to protect Beck or because of circumstances connected to the case. Once those statements were retracted, investigators and later historians were left with an unresolved question: which alleged murders, if any, could be independently established? Some deaths were investigated as possible connections. Others remained matters of suspicion. Still others existed primarily within Fernandez's own statements. That uncertainty is one of the most important facts about the case. It is tempting to describe Fernandez and Beck simply as serial killers responsible for 17 or 20 murders. The phrase is dramatic, and it fits the reputation the couple acquired. But it goes beyond what was established at trial. Their confirmed conviction was for one murder. That does not mean the other allegations should be ignored. It means they must be described accurately. The distinction protects the historical record and, just as importantly, respects the victims. A victim whose death cannot be conclusively connected to Fernandez and Beck should not be turned into a statistic merely to make the story more sensational. At the same time, the possibility that other women may have been harmed remains an important part of understanding the case. Fernandez's confession was significant precisely because it suggested a pattern far larger than the single murder that could be proven, but the lack of sufficient evidence meant that the full extent of that pattern could never be established with the same certainty as Faye's murder. This uncertainty also changes how the case should be remembered. The title Lonely Hearts Killers can create the impression of a neatly defined series of crimes, each one established and documented. The reality was more complicated. There was a method of deception. There was a partnership. There were confirmed deaths. There were suspected connections. There were allegations. There was a confession and a later retraction. And there was one murder conviction that brought the case to a legal conclusion. That is not a less disturbing story. In some ways, it is more unsettling because it leaves questions unanswered. The lives of the people who may have been connected to Fernandez and Beck cannot simply be reconstructed from a number. Each alleged victim represented a separate human life. And every uncertainty means that the historical record has limits. The same caution applies to Fernandez and Beck themselves. Understanding their actions does not require romanticizing their relationship or treating their attachment as a tragic love story. Their continued affection on death row does not change the consequences of what happened. The relationship was part of a criminal partnership, and its emotional intensity existed alongside deception and violence. Fernandez had used romantic trust as a means of gaining access to women. Beck had learned about his activities and chosen to participate. Her jealousy toward the women Fernandez approached became an important element in the events surrounding Faye. Whatever emotional attachment existed between Fernandez and Beck, it cannot be separated from the harm their partnership caused. As the date of execution approached, the two remained prisoners at Sing Sing. They were no longer able to move between locations or establish relationships through advertisements. Their ability to manipulate new victims had ended. The false identities they had constructed could no longer provide protection. The legal system had taken control of their movements and their future. Yet their final communications reportedly continued to express their attachment to each other. On March 8, 1951, nearly 2 years after their convictions, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck were taken to the execution chamber at Sing Sing. Fernandez was executed first. Beck followed. Both died in the electric chair. Fernandez was 36 years old. Beck was approximately 30 years old. With their executions, the legal chapter of the case came to an end. But the historical questions remained. The deaths of Fernandez and Beck did not reveal the final number of women who may have been victims of their scheme. They did not resolve every disappearance or suspicious death associated with their names. They did not turn Fernandez's confession into a verified list of 17 or 20 murders. And they could not change what had already happened to Janet Faye, Delphine Downing, and Downing's young daughter. What remained was a case in which certainty and uncertainty existed side by side. Janet Faye's murder was established in court. The deaths of Downing and her daughter were central to the investigation that brought Fernandez and Beck into custody. Other alleged victims remained part of a larger, unresolved history. This is why the final assessment of the case must resist the easiest version of the story. Fernandez and Beck were not simply characters in a sensational tale about a murderous couple. They were two people who made deliberate choices that brought deception and violence into the lives of others. The women they encountered were not foolish for wanting companionship. They were targeted because someone recognized that desire as something that could be exploited. The loneliness that drew people toward advertisements became the opening through which Fernandez entered their lives. That is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the case. The danger was not obvious. There was no warning sign attached to the first communication. The initial contact could appear ordinary. A person answered an advertisement because she hoped to meet someone. Fernandez answered because he saw an opportunity. The tragedy was created in the space between those two intentions. Martha Beck's involvement made that deception more complicated. By presenting herself as Fernandez's sister, she could help make him appear more trustworthy. But her jealousy also contributed to the instability that surrounded his relationships with other women. Together, the two created an environment in which emotional trust could become a weapon. When the case finally reached the courtroom, the law had to strip away the mythology and concentrate on evidence. It could not convict them of every death that had been associated with their names. It could convict them of the murder that prosecutors could establish. The jury did exactly that. Fernandez and Beck were found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Janet Faye, and the sentence was death. Their executions in 1951 ended their lives, but they did not answer every question. How many women had actually been victimized? How many deaths were truly connected to the couple? Which parts of Fernandez's confession were true, and which were not? Those questions remain inseparable from the history of the Lonely Hearts Killers. But perhaps the most important conclusion is simpler. Janet Faye should not be remembered merely as one number in a disputed total. She was a 66-year-old woman who believed she was entering a relationship based on trust. That trust was betrayed. Her body was hidden, but her death ultimately became the one murder that the legal system could prove against both Fernandez and Beck. The case therefore closes not with a number, but with a person. The advertisements promised connection. The relationship promised companionship. Behind those promises was deception. And when the deception was finally exposed, the consequences could no longer be hidden beneath concrete, concealed in a basement, or buried inside a confession. The story of Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck survives because of the unanswered questions. But it should be remembered first for the people who were harmed. The legend may speak of 17 victims, perhaps 20. The courtroom proved one murder. And that difference is not a technical detail. It is the boundary between what history suspects and what history can honestly say it knows. The executions of Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck on March 8, 1951, brought the legal story of the Lonely Hearts Killers to an end, but they did not bring certainty to every question surrounding the case. Fernandez was 36 years old when he was executed. Beck was approximately 30. Both died in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison, after nearly 2 years had passed since their convictions for the murder of Janet J. Faye. Their deaths closed the final chapter of the prosecution, but the larger historical questions remained. How many women had actually been victimized by Fernandez? How many deaths could truly be connected to him and Beck? How much of Fernandez's confession was accurate? And how much had been exaggerated or later withdrawn? Those questions matter because the case has often been remembered through numbers that were never established in court. Fernandez reportedly claimed 17 victims. while other accounts later suggested approximately 20. Such figures became part of the mythology surrounding the couple. But the legal record was much narrower. Fernandez and Beck were convicted of one murder, the killing of Janet Faye. That distinction is essential. It is also a reminder of how easily a notorious case can become simplified as it passes from investigation to newspaper coverage. From newspaper coverage to popular history, and eventually into the larger culture of true crime. The phrase "lonely hearts killers" is powerful because it immediately creates an image. Two people using personal advertisements to find victims. But the real story is more complicated. There was no proven list of 17 or 20 murder convictions. There was a confirmed murder, other deaths that became central to the investigation, suspicions about additional victims, and a confession whose reliability became disputed after Fernandez later retracted some or all of it. The difference between those categories should never be ignored. At the center of the case was Janet Faye, a 66-year-old woman whose death was established in court. She had entered the relationship with Fernandez, believing she might have found companionship. Instead, the relationship ended in violence. She was struck in the head, strangled, and concealed beneath concrete. When investigators discovered her body on March 1, 1949, they uncovered not only the remains of a woman who had been killed, but evidence of an attempt to hide what had happened. The concealment did not succeed. Faye's death became the foundation of the prosecution that eventually sent both Fernandez and Beck to death row. The case also involved Delphine Downing and her young daughter, whose deaths in Michigan became an important part of the chain of events leading to the arrest of Fernandez and Beck. Downing was 28, a widow, and a mother. Her daughter was a young child who had no role in the adult relationships that had brought Fernandez and Beck together with other women. The circumstances surrounding their deaths were horrifying, and the discovery of their bodies transformed the investigation. Their deaths helped expose the scale of the danger surrounding the couple. Even though the eventual murder conviction focused on Janet Faye, that distinction does not make Downing and her daughter less important. It simply reflects the difference between an investigative discovery and a charge that prosecutors could establish in court. Their names belong to the history of the investigation, just as Faye's name belongs to the confirmed murder conviction. The case also leaves behind a difficult question about vulnerability. The women who responded to Lonely Hearts advertisements were not doing something foolish or shameful. They were looking for companionship. They were participating in a form of social contact available to people who wanted to meet someone beyond their immediate circles. Fernandez recognized that system as an opportunity. He could present himself as a man looking for love while secretly viewing the relationship as a means of exploitation. That deception is perhaps the most disturbing element of the case because it required no obvious force at the beginning. The victim approached the relationship voluntarily. She believed she was choosing to meet someone. The danger was hidden inside the identity of the person she believed she was meeting. Fernandez's method depended on that gap between appearance and reality. He could present himself as courteous and trustworthy. He could allow the woman to believe that the relationship was developing naturally. And when Martha Beck appeared as his supposed sister, the deception could become even more convincing. A second person could make the first person appear safer. Instead of encountering a mysterious man alone, a woman could encounter a man accompanied by a woman who appeared to know him intimately as family. The false family created an appearance of normality. But the relationship between Fernandez and Beck was anything but normal. Beck had learned about Fernandez's fraud and chosen to participate. Her involvement transformed the scheme from the actions of one man into a partnership. At the same time, her jealousy created a dangerous contradiction. Fernandez needed relationships with other women because those relationships were central to his method. Beck wanted Fernandez's attention for herself. The women he approached were therefore both targets and rivals. Janet Faye became caught inside that conflict. and her death demonstrated how quickly jealousy could turn an already deceptive relationship into violence. The case also raises an important issue about the meaning of a confession. Fernandez's statements were among the most sensational elements of the investigation. If his original claim of 17 victims had been fully verified, the historical picture would be dramatically different. But the confession was not enough by itself. Fernandez later withdrew some or all of it and said that he had confessed to protect Beck or because of circumstances surrounding the case. Without independent evidence establishing every alleged killing, the number remained uncertain. This is why responsible accounts must distinguish between what Fernandez claimed and what investigators and prosecutors could actually prove. In true crime storytelling, that distinction is especially important. A dramatic confession can become more memorable than the evidence itself. A number can become more famous than the names of the victims. But a responsible account should work in the opposite direction. It should begin with what is known, identify what is disputed, and acknowledge what remains unresolved. The case of Fernandez and Beck provides a clear example of why that approach matters. The number 17 may be part of the story, but it is not equivalent to 17 proven murders. The number 20 may appear in later accounts, but it is not a confirmed total. What is confirmed is that Fernandez and Beck were convicted of the first-degree murder of Janet Faye. They were sentenced to death, held at Sing Sing, and executed on March 8, 1951. Everything beyond that requires careful qualification. Their deaths also meant that some questions would remain unanswered permanently. Fernandez could no longer clarify his changing statements. Beck could no longer provide her own account of every allegation surrounding the pair. Whatever knowledge they possessed about other suspected deaths died with them. That does not prove the allegations, but it does explain why the historical record contains gaps. There is no final statement that transforms every suspicion into certainty. There is only the evidence that survived. That uncertainty should not become an excuse to romanticize the pair. Their emotional attachment to one another continued even on death row. But that attachment should not be mistaken for a tragic love story. Their relationship was intertwined with deception and criminal activity. Fernandez deliberately used romantic trust as a means of gaining access to women. Beck learned what he was doing and chose to join him. Her jealousy became part of the circumstances surrounding Faye's death. Whatever affection existed between them cannot erase those choices. The most enduring legacy of the case, therefore, belongs not to the couple, but to the warning embedded in what happened to their victims. Trust can be exploited when a person deliberately presents a false identity. Loneliness can be manipulated when someone recognizes that the desire for companionship creates an opening. And a relationship that appears ordinary from the outside can conceal intentions that the other person has no reason to suspect. The Lonely Hearts advertisements themselves were not the problem. Wanting love was not the problem. The wrongdoing came from the deliberate decision to exploit another person's trust. That is why Janet Faye's story remains central. She was not merely an entry in a list of alleged victims. She was a woman whose death was proven. Her body was concealed, but the evidence eventually brought the crime into the open. Her case became the legal point at which the story of Fernandez and Beck could be judged according to evidence rather than rumor. The broader allegations remain part of the historical record, but they must remain allegations unless independently established. In the end, the story of the Lonely Hearts Killers is not simply about two criminals who used advertisements to find women. It is about the distance between what a person believes she is entering and what another person secretly intends. It is about trust being turned into access, affection being turned into manipulation, and a seemingly ordinary search for companionship becoming dangerous because the person on the other side of the relationship was not who he claimed to be. Fernandez and Beck died in 1951, but the case continued to live in public memory because of its unanswered questions and its unusual method. Yet the most responsible way to remember it is not through the largest possible number of victims. It is through the facts that can be established. Janet Faye was murdered. Delphine Downing and her daughter were found dead in circumstances that brought the couple into police custody. Fernandez made extraordinary claims about other killings and later retracted some or all of his confession. Investigators suspected additional connections, but not all could be proven. Fernandez and Beck were convicted of one murder and executed for it. That is the boundary between the known and the unknown. And within that boundary, the human story remains clear. People were searching for companionship, and someone deliberately turned that search into an opportunity for harm. The name Lonely Hearts Killers may endure, but the lesson should not be about the killers themselves. It should be about the victims whose trust was betrayed, the evidence that eventually exposed the deception, and the importance of remembering that behind every sensational case is a real person whose life cannot be reduced to a headline, a number, or a legend. The story of Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck did not truly end when the electric chair ended their lives on March 8, 1951. The executions closed the legal proceedings, but they could not close every question created by the investigation. There remained the deaths that had been connected to the couple with varying degrees of certainty. The extraordinary claims made by Fernandez after his arrest, and the later retraction that prevented those claims from becoming a definitive account of every crime attributed to them. In the decades that followed, the name Lonely Hearts Killers became associated with a number of 17 or even 20 victims. But the most responsible way to understand the case is to recognize that those numbers were never established as murder convictions. Fernandez and Beck were convicted of the first-degree murder of Janet J. Fay. That was the crime proved against them in court. Everything beyond that must be separated into confirmed events, suspected connections, and allegations. This distinction is not merely a legal technicality. It determines how the victims should be remembered and how the case should be presented to future generations. Janet Fay was 66 years old. She had entered Fernandez's life believing she was pursuing companionship. Her death became the central murder prosecution because investigators could establish the circumstances surrounding it. Her body was discovered beneath concrete in Queens on March 1, 1949. She had been bound. A white cloth had been found around her neck, and the examination revealed a fractured larynx and serious injuries to her head. These facts gave investigators something that suspicion alone could never provide: physical evidence of a specific homicide. The circumstances preceding Fay's death were also significant. Beck discovered Fay in bed with Fernandez. A confrontation followed. Fay was struck in the head, and Fernandez subsequently strangled her. Her body was then concealed. The sequence connected the personal conflict between Beck and Fay with the physical evidence found after Fay's disappearance. That combination became the foundation of the prosecution. But the case also contained another confirmed set of deaths that played a crucial role in bringing Fernandez and Beck into custody. Delphine Downing was a 28-year-old widow with a young daughter. In Michigan, according to the supplied information, Fernandez gave Downing medication that rendered her unconscious. When her daughter began crying, Beck lost control. The child was killed, and Downing was subsequently shot. Their bodies were hidden in the basement. Police arrived on March 1, 1949, and the discovery led to the arrest of Fernandez and Beck. The events surrounding Downing and her daughter, therefore, became an essential part of the investigative story. Yet the legal case that resulted in death sentences remained focused on Fay. This is another example of why the history cannot be reduced to a simple victim count. The investigation revealed more than the prosecution ultimately proved. That difference is common in complex criminal cases. But in this case, it became especially important because Fernandez himself supplied a dramatic explanation for a much larger number of deaths. His confession reportedly included 17 victims, while other accounts placed the number around 20. For a time, such statements seemed to suggest that investigators had discovered a far larger killing operation. But a confession is only one piece of evidence. When Fernandez later withdrew some or all of his confession, the reliability of the entire account became an issue. He explained that he had made the statements to protect Beck or because of circumstances connected with the case. Once that happened, every alleged victim had to be considered separately. Was there independent evidence? Could the death be connected to Fernandez or Beck? Was there a body? Was there testimony? Could the circumstances be verified? Without sufficient evidence, an allegation could not become a murder conviction simply because Fernandez had once claimed responsibility. This is perhaps the most important unresolved element of the case. We know that Fernandez and Beck were capable of deception. We know they used romantic relationships as part of their scheme. We know that violence occurred. We know that Faye was murdered and that Downing and her daughter were found dead. We know that Fernandez claimed responsibility for other killings. But we do not have a court-established total of 17 or 20 victims. The uncertainty cannot be removed simply by repeating the larger number. If anything, repetition makes it more important to explain the distinction. There is also an unanswered question about motive. Fernandez's method clearly involved exploitation. He sought out women through Lonely Hearts advertisements, created a false appearance of romantic interest, and looked for opportunities to obtain money or property. But the supplied information does not establish a single explanation for every act of violence. Beck's jealousy appears to have been an important factor in the circumstances surrounding Faye, but it would be speculative to apply one motive to every suspected death. The available evidence supports a pattern of deception and exploitation, with violence becoming part of that pattern, but it does not provide a complete psychological explanation for every event attributed to the pair. That limitation is important. True crime stories often try to explain criminals through a single motive or personality. But human behavior is rarely that simple, and the supplied evidence does not justify inventing a complete psychological profile. What can be said is that Beck became deeply attached to Fernandez and remained with him even after learning about his fraudulent activities. She participated in the deception. She sometimes presented herself as his sister, helping create an appearance of safety around him. At the same time, her jealousy toward women Fernandez approached created a dangerous conflict within their partnership. Fernandez needed those relationships to continue his scheme. Beck did not want those women to become genuine romantic partners. That tension was especially significant in the events involving Faye. The case also raises questions about the role of trust. The women who responded to Lonely Hearts advertisements were not inherently vulnerable simply because they wanted companionship. Their desire was ordinary. Their trust was exploited by someone who understood how to make himself appear acceptable. Fernandez did not need to force his way into their lives. The women could voluntarily meet him because they believed the relationship was genuine. This made the deception particularly effective. Beck's presence could even reinforce the illusion. A man appearing with a woman he described as his sister might seem more socially grounded and less threatening than a stranger arriving alone. That appearance of normality became part of the mechanism through which trust was created. The tragedy is that the very things that could have made the relationship feel safer were incorporated into the deception. The case also illustrates the limits of the historical record. When Fernandez and Beck were executed, there was no final accounting of every suspected crime. Their deaths meant that whatever additional information they possessed about other alleged victims disappeared with them. The investigation had reached its legal conclusion, but not every historical question had been answered. That does not prove that every allegation was true. It simply means that some questions remained unresolved. In a case with such a sensational reputation, unresolved questions can easily become exaggerated into certainty. A suspected victim becomes a confirmed victim. A confession becomes an established fact. A number becomes a definitive total. Over time, those distinctions can disappear. That is why the case requires careful narration. The Lonely Hearts killers were not convicted of 17 or 20 murders. They were convicted of one murder, Janet Faye's. They were sentenced to death and executed in 1951. Their broader history includes the deaths of Downing and her daughter, Fernandez's confession and retraction, and suspicions about additional victims. Those elements are all important, but they do not have equal evidentiary status. Remembering that difference is a form of respect for the truth. It is also a form of respect for the victims. Sensational numbers can make a case more famous, but they can also reduce individual lives to statistics. Janet Faye was not victim number one in a story whose final total remains uncertain. She was a woman with her own life, her own hopes, and her own belief that she was entering a relationship. Her death was real, and it was proven. Delphine Downing and her daughter likewise deserve to be remembered as individuals rather than simply as pieces of an investigation. The same principle should guide any discussion of other women who may have encountered Fernandez. If their deaths cannot be established as crimes committed by him and Beck, they should not be assigned that status without evidence. The legacy of the case therefore lies in two different directions. One is the enduring warning about deception and misplaced trust. The other is the importance of distinguishing evidence from legend. The Lonely Hearts advertisements were not themselves dangerous. The danger came from someone using another person's desire for companionship as a means of exploitation. The tragedy began when Fernandez treated emotional trust as an opportunity rather than a human relationship. Beck became part of that system, and her jealousy added another destructive dimension. Their partnership ultimately led to a murder conviction and death sentences. But the case should not be remembered because the criminals were fascinating. It should be remembered because the victims were real. More than 7 decades after the executions, the exact number of deaths associated with Fernandez and Beck remains uncertain. The figure of 17 remains part of the story because it came from Fernandez's own statements. Other accounts have suggested approximately 20. But the evidence presented in court established one murder conviction. That is the line a responsible account must maintain. The final lesson is therefore not a number. It is a method. When a story contains confession, suspicion, physical evidence, and competing claims, each must be placed in its proper category. What is proven should be called proven. What is suspected should remain suspected. What is claimed should be identified as a claim. And what remains unknown should be allowed to remain unknown. That approach may make the story less sensational, but it makes it more truthful. Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck became infamous because they turned the search for companionship into an avenue for deception and violence. But their notoriety should never become the center of the story. The center should remain with the people who trusted them, the people who were harmed, and the evidence that eventually exposed what had been hidden. The concrete could conceal Janet Faye's body, but it could not erase her existence. The basement could conceal the bodies of Delphine Downing and her daughter, but it could not prevent investigators from finding them. And the changing statements of Fernandez could complicate the truth, but they could not change the one fact established beyond dispute: Janet Faye was murdered, and Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck were convicted of her killing. That is the part of the story that the evidence allows us to say with certainty. Everything else belongs to the questions that remain. The story of Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck has survived for decades because it contains all the elements that can transform a criminal case into a lasting legend. False identities, Lonely Hearts advertisements, financial deception, jealousy, concealed bodies, a dramatic confession, disputed claims about additional victims, a sensational trial, and 2 executions at Sing Sing. Yet the longer the story remains in public memory, the more important it becomes to separate the legend from the evidence. Fernandez and Beck were convicted of the first-degree murder of Janet J. Faye. They were not convicted of 17 murders, nor of 20. The larger numbers came from allegations and from Fernandez's own statements after his arrest. Statements that he later withdrew in part or in whole. That distinction is the foundation for understanding the case responsibly. It is also the point at which the story becomes less about the mythology of two notorious criminals and more about the people whose trust was exploited. Fernandez's method depended on something ordinary, the human desire for companionship. The women who answered Lonely Hearts advertisements were not searching for danger. They were searching for another person. Fernandez understood that desire and used it as a means of access. He could present himself as a man looking for a relationship while privately viewing the women he contacted as opportunities for financial exploitation. The deception was powerful precisely because it did not begin with obvious violence. It began with a promise. That promise could be a letter, a conversation, or the possibility of a new relationship. To the person receiving it, the encounter could seem hopeful. To Fernandez, according to the pattern described in the case, it could be part of a calculated scheme. Martha Beck's presence added another layer to that deception. She became Fernandez's partner after learning about his fraudulent activities, choosing not to leave him and instead participating in the operation. She could present herself as his sister, creating an appearance of normality and trust. For a woman meeting Fernandez through a personal advertisement, the presence of another woman might make the situation feel less threatening. The false family relationship could become part of the disguise. Yet Beck was not simply a passive participant. Her jealousy was an important element of the relationship. Fernandez depended on women for the continuation of his scheme, while Beck viewed those women as rivals for his affection. This contradiction created a volatile partnership. Janet Faye became caught in that conflict, and the result was fatal. According to the evidence described in the case, Beck encountered Faye in bed with Fernandez. A confrontation followed. Faye was struck in the head, and Fernandez strangled her. Her body was concealed beneath concrete. When police discovered her remains on March 1, 1949, the deception began to collapse. Faye's death provided the specific murder that could ultimately be prosecuted. Her injuries and the circumstances surrounding the concealment of her body created evidence that could be presented to a jury. The prosecution did not need to prove every allegation associated with Fernandez and Beck. It needed to prove this murder. The same principle applied to the events involving Delphine Downing and her young daughter. Their deaths were an important part of the investigation and directly contributed to the arrest of Fernandez and Beck. Downing was 28 and a widow. Her daughter was a young child. According to the supplied information, Fernandez gave Downing medication that rendered her unconscious. When the child began crying, Beck lost control. The child was killed, and Downing was subsequently shot. Their bodies were hidden in the basement. Police arrived on March 1, 1949, and the discovery transformed the case. But again, the distinction between investigative importance and legal conviction must be maintained. The eventual trial focused on Faye's murder. This is not a contradiction. It is how a criminal prosecution works. Investigators may uncover a wider pattern than prosecutors can establish in court. A suspect may be connected to several suspicious deaths without there being sufficient evidence to charge or convict that person for every death. Fernandez's confession made that problem even more visible. His claim of 17 victims, and later references to approximately 20, suggested a much larger history. But his later retraction prevented those numbers from becoming an established fact. Without independent evidence, the confession could not transform every alleged death into a proven murder. The case therefore teaches an important lesson about the difference between confession and corroboration. A confession can be powerful. It can reveal information that investigators did not previously possess. But it still has to be evaluated. Fernandez's changing account meant that investigators had to determine which portions could be supported by evidence. That process produced a narrower but more reliable conclusion: one murder conviction. The uncertainty surrounding other possible victims does not mean that those allegations were meaningless. It means that the historical record must preserve their uncertain status. There may have been additional victims. There may have been deaths that investigators could not connect conclusively to the couple. but it is not responsible to convert possibility into certainty. The same caution should apply to the number of victims often attached to the case. 17 is part of the historical narrative because Fernandez reportedly gave that figure. Approximately 20 appears in other accounts. Neither figure should be presented as an established murder total. The strongest evidence remains the evidence connected to the specific crimes that could be demonstrated. That distinction also changes the way the victims should be remembered. In sensational true crime stories, victims can easily become numbers. Once a case acquires a dramatic label, the human beings at its center can disappear behind the reputation of the perpetrators. Janet Faye should not be reduced to the one murder they were convicted of. She was a 66-year-old woman who believed she was pursuing companionship. Her life ended violently, and her body was deliberately concealed. The legal system eventually recognized what had happened to her by convicting Fernandez and Beck. Delphine Downing and her daughter should likewise be remembered as individuals whose deaths became a crucial turning point in the investigation. Their presence in the story is not merely evidence leading to an arrest. Their lives were lost, and their deaths exposed the danger surrounding Fernandez and Beck. The case also demonstrates how appearances can become part of a criminal strategy. Fernandez presented himself as a potential romantic partner. Beck presented herself as his sister. Together, they could create an image of ordinary social life. But that appearance concealed a different reality. This is what made their methods so difficult to detect. The victims were not necessarily confronted by someone who looked dangerous. Instead, they were invited into relationships that appeared to offer companionship. The threat existed behind the identity being presented to them. The lesson is not that people should be afraid of seeking relationships. Wanting companionship is a normal human desire. The lesson is that trust should not be confused with certainty. A person can appear kind and respectable while concealing intentions that are completely different from the ones being presented. Fernandez's crimes, as established by the case, depended on exploiting that difference. Beck's involvement demonstrated how another person could reinforce the appearance of safety while simultaneously participating in the deception. The final years of their lives provide a strange but important contrast. After their conviction, Fernandez and Beck were held separately at Sing Sing. They continued to write to each other and maintained their emotional attachment. On March 8, 1951, both were executed in the electric chair. Fernandez died first. Beck followed. Their relationship ended with their executions, but the consequences of their actions remained with the people they had harmed and the families left behind. Their deaths did not reveal the truth about every alleged victim. They did not clarify every statement Fernandez had made. They simply ended the lives of the two people who had been convicted in Faye's murder. More than 7 decades later, the case remains a reminder that the most dramatic version of a story is not always the most accurate. The title Lonely Hearts Killers is memorable, but the history beneath it is more complicated. There was one murder conviction. There were other deaths that became central to the investigation. There were suspicions about additional victims. There was a confession and a retraction. There were unanswered questions that may never be resolved. A responsible retelling must preserve all of those distinctions. The most important lesson is therefore not the number of victims. It is the mechanism of exploitation. Fernandez recognized loneliness as an opening. He used the hope of companionship to gain access and trust. Beck became part of that deception, while her jealousy contributed to the violent conflict surrounding Faye. The result was a crime that shocked the public not simply because of its brutality, but because the doorway to the violence was something so ordinary, the desire to find someone to love. That is why the case continues to resonate. It reminds us that danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a letter from a stranger who seems interested in knowing you. Sometimes the person who appears to make a situation safer is actually part of the deception. And sometimes the truth is hidden so effectively that it takes the discovery of a body to expose what happened. Yet even then, the truth may remain incomplete. Fernandez and Beck were convicted of Janet Faye's murder, and that fact should remain the anchor of the story. The larger allegations should be treated with caution, not certainty. In the end, the legacy of the Lonely Hearts Killers belongs not to the legend of 17 or 20 victims, but to the evidence that survived and the lives that were lost. The advertisements promised connection. Fernandez turned that promise into exploitation. Beck joined him. Faye paid the ultimate price. Downing and her daughter became part of the investigation that exposed the couple. And the courtroom ultimately drew a clear line between what could be proven and what could only be suspected. That line is where the responsible history of the case ends. The rest is unanswered. And perhaps that is the most unsettling conclusion of all. Not that every question has an answer, but that some questions remain forever beyond the reach of certainty.